Notts 1, Walsall 2. It was a big game at the top of League 2, and in today's video, we're going to analyse that game and talk about what tactical adjustments Matt Sadler made in order to win all 3 points for his Walsall side. Welcome back to the channel. Bit of a different video today, inspired a little bit, I guess, by the kind of Monday Night Football analysis of an individual game. In today's video, we're going to go through just one game and pick apart and talk about all the different elements and aspects of this one. If you guys enjoyed this video or like the idea and the sound of this, and you want to see it for different games, do let me know. I'm going to, I think, reserve it for kind of big games. I know that sounds a bit crazy to say about a game in League 2 kind of halfway through the season, but this did have a big game feel to it, especially from a Notts County point of view. It was first versus third, and Walsall fans have said after the game that Notts are the best side that they've come up against this season. So I do think it had a big game feel to it. It kind of was the significant test to see if Walsall could go on and win the league. And as you've seen by the result, I think we can. But it was definitely a really interesting game. It was a game of two halves, to use a cliche. It really was. And in this video, we're going to analyse just how the game changed and what adjustments were made by Matt Sadler, and probably why Walsall are top of the table. I also thought this was a good one to do because obviously Notts County, the team that I support, but Walsall are a team that I have done a tactical breakdown on very recently. That is on the channel, so go and watch that after you've watched this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that one as much as hopefully you enjoyed this one. I think the key starting point to talk about, though, in this game is the fact that it was kind of night and day between the two halves. And the first half, as we're going to dive into in just a moment, was dominance from Notts County. If we just look at some of the stats on the screen here, we can see that this is the first half stats, and Notts absolutely and thoroughly did dominate. 79% possession to Walsall's 21%, and you can see the XG there, absolutely massive, 1.4 to Walsall's 0.1. And that's from not that many more shots, okay, twice as many shots, but you wouldn't expect kind of that much more XG. So kind of does tell you the dominance. Even the accurate passes, just 70 for Walsall compared to 379 for Notts County. So straight away, we've got an image building up there that this was certainly a dominant performance from Notts County. And so for the start of the video, we're going to go to the tactics whiteboard and show you how the two sides set up. We've got the two teams here. Obviously, Walsall on the right-hand side in the red. They set up in a 5-3-2. And Notts County, very similar 5-3-2. Or you could argue that it was kind of this shape as well, with the 5-2-2-1. And as we're going to explore in the first half, the Notts' shape was a lot more fluid than is on paper, whereas Walsall's was very rigid and was very much, you can pick up the positions just from looking at, kind of at a glance. It was obvious what kind of system they were playing. Do want to highlight a couple of key things in the lineups to talk about. One was the fact that Walsall finally had to drop Taylor Allen. If you have watched the Walsall tactical breakdown and you went away and watched that first before watching this, you'll know that Taylor Allen was kind of one of the main focuses of that video. He was not in this game. It's been a relentless schedule for Walsall, so he did come on, so it definitely is not like a massive injury. I think he just needed a rest. And Albert Adoma started up front instead of Jamil Matt, and that is a prescient point for later on. For Notts, the key players to sort of talk about is the right centre-back. This was Rod McDonald in this game. He is a left-footed centre-back. He was in because both Lewis Macari and Lucas Ness are out injured. So it meant that Rod McDonald had to come in to the team. As we'll talk about, he forms a key part in this game. And also at left wing-back, Josh Martin, he was man of the match pretty much against Cheltenham in the previous game, and he was again chosen at left wing back, significant because he's a right footer, and we'll talk a lot about him as we go along. As you saw, Notts had a massive amount of possession, 79%, which isn't a huge amount to have over a sustained period over 45 minutes. And that was a lot of the reason for that was Walsall basically sat off Notts. And at first, I was very impressed with Walsall's out of possession play. So let's just have a quick look at that. Their back five was very, very narrow, like so. And then their midfield three, the space between the lines was extremely tight. They were extremely compact. They had a tight midfield three. And then the front two weren't really pressing. It was very much they were sitting off of Notts. And what that did was it obviously was intended to sort of sit in and try and frustrate Notts and challenge Notts to unlock them. They were never quite sat this deep, but they were compact as they went across the pitch together. So they always stayed very close together as a complete block, kind of a mid block, I suppose you could call it. But it was always together. They moved in tandem as a full 10. And what that meant was it was challenging Notts to try and break the lines, really. And that is kind of the key thing to mention early on. So as we just set Notts up here, Notts were very much more expansive and had a lot more of the possession. It was very much played in Walsall's half. But as we can see, this is an extremely hard shape for Notts to break down, and it's kind of challenging them to get caught offside. Now, that was what Notts basically did. They managed to get Alassane Jatta in behind on 2 occasions very, very early on. So you may have seen the goal line clearance. It kind of went viral online. But basically, Alassane Jatta was able to get in behind. He took it round Simpkin, and from around this kind of shooting area, it was then cleared off the line by, I think it was Evan Weir that cleared it off the line for Walsall. But that was kind of a warning sign for Walsall that they, whilst they were playing a compact block, they still had quite a high line. And Jatta was able to get in behind. It happened again. It was actually Josh Martin, and we're going to talk about his positioning in a minute. He kind of came inside from the left wing back position. He was there to keep Conor Barrett quiet, and Conor Barrett was very quiet, but he was able to drift into this inside area. And Alassane Jatta made the same run off the shoulder. He was playing on the shoulder of the last line of defence. Made the run off the shoulder, went clean through and scored. So gave Notts an early-ish lead. And Notts were obviously, of course, were dominant, but that was the first tactical thing I wanted to talk about, and the first adjustment that Walsall made. They probably should have made the adjustment after the first warning shot. It was kind of, going clean through and having it clear off the line. It should be an alarm bell ringing. It didn't, and it was allowed to happen again. But straight after that, Walsall did actually drop off a little bit more. They sat off Notts even more so. And what this did was it meant that Notts were able to push up the pitch even further. But what it did mean was that the front two would kind of go beyond the midfield double pivot that Notts had of George Abbott and Matty Palmer. So they would kind of half try and press this Notts back three. You then had the midfield three, who were always tight to the back five, who were trying to help deal with Dan Crowley, David McGoldrick, Josh Martin, Alassane Jatta. It was kind of those 4 causing issues. Sam Austin was occupying the left wing back. He was a lot more of a traditional wing back on his preferred foot, his right foot. He actually got into this area at one point and had a chance kind of from this angle. But he was much more holding that width. And what it meant was that this two, so Matty Palmer and George Abbott, they were completely free to play passes and break the lines. Because they were not being pressed, they had loads of time on the ball, and they were able to put those passes through the Walsall. They were able to break the Walsall lines. And a part of that as well was the positioning of 3 men, Dan Crowley, Dave McGoldrick, and Josh Martin, and the rotations between them. So Josh Martin is more of a winger by trade. He would come inside here, and Dave McGoldrick would go back out wide. That's how we got the opening goal, was he picked up the play from in between the lines. But wherever they would go, they would find that kind of space. If they came over to press, say it was Abbott that had the ball, McGoldrick would try and find a space in between the line. Martin would as well. Crowley would drop deep to receive, giving all these different passing options. So whilst it was such a narrow, hard to play through midfield three, because there was no pressure being applied directly to the player in possession, they were able to take their time and pick a pass. and the intelligence of Martin, McGoldrick and Crowley meant that they were able to pick up pockets of space in between the lines. And that was the key thing that Notts did in the first half to really control the game. They also cycled possession as well, but that was the key offensive thing they did to control the game. The other thing that Notts did to really control the first half was they cycled possession deep. And what this did is it took away what Walsall are good at. And if you go and watch the tactical breakdown, you will see that they are so good at being efficient and quick with their play. As soon as they get possession, they look to play forwards all the time. And they still did that because Notts kind of took the sting out of the game. They would move the ball round the back three, even back to Bass, who of course was a little bit more advanced than that. And because they've got a front two, it's a front two pressing a back four. The midfield three were reluctant to jump out of their shape. So as soon as you had two go to press those two, well, all it took was a ball out to Bass, back out the other side, and Notts were away. Ron McDonald, by the way, I thought was very good in the first half on his left foot. That chance of Sam Austin we mentioned earlier came from his kind of pass into this channel with his left foot. But he was not pressed at all. He had the ability to receive onto his left foot, stronger left foot, then turn out, play inside. So Notts had all these angles and control. And what it did mean was that if a pass was misplaced, that's kind of how Walsall would win the ball back. As soon as they got it, they would rush things. So it wouldn't give Connor Barrett time to join the attack, which is what one of their strongest facets of their attack is, allowing Barrett to get involved. Because Walsall win the ball back quite a lot, he knows the trigger for him to make the move is to do that. But because Walsall weren't winning the ball back anywhere near as much against Notts, he was unable to have that trigger to then make the run down the side. It meant they were going straight into the forwards. The rest of the team was far too deep. So you've got two players isolated. These two midfielders from Notts were closer to the ball than the midfield three of Walsall, so they were able to close the gap quickly. The back three were able to get more compact, and all of a sudden they crowd out Walsall and win the ball back. So everything from Walsall was rushed because they were far, far too deep. And this was kind of like the average positions, if you like, of the Walsall side, is look how deep they are. And it's no surprise they couldn't counter quickly enough because they were 5 to 10 yards too deep. All of that meant that Notts went in at half-time 1-0 up. But as we go on to the second half, we're going to look at some of the half-time changes that were made by Walsall. And let's now look at some of the stats to depict how different the second half went. And then we're going to look at the adjustments, the tactical adjustments that Matt Sadler made. Now we can have a look at the stats, of course, from the second half. And you can see straight away that Notts, of course, still had more of the ball, kind of a given, especially given the two stars of the sides. Walsall aren't a possession-based team. But the drop-off is absolutely massive. Let's just compare and contrast it there. 79 to 21. You can see how much that slider moves for possession straight away. And, of course, the biggest thing that also jumps out is the expected goals. We spoke about it in the first half and the amount of shots. Again, not that many more shots from Walsall than Notts. There were more again, but again, it's not like it's 25 shots to none. Notts still had shots, but you can see the massive, absolutely key difference is 1.87 compared to 0.23. Absolutely huge. Passes still for Notts, but look at the drop off in the amount of passes made. 379 within the first half, and then down to 194 in the second half. 6% drop off in terms of pass accuracy. Again, Walsall didn't make that many more passes, and the accuracy also wasn't. It was a little bit. It was 8% higher, but you see that the amount of passes is significantly different for Notts than it is compared to Walsall, and hopefully that gives a clear picture of what is going to come up in this second half. The changes were made at half time. Jamil Matt, who we mentioned at the start, he came on for Albert Adoma, who was largely ineffective in the first half. And his impact and how important that change would be was obvious at the time because he's such an important player for them and such a big threat. But also is obvious after the game because obviously if you have seen the score and a spoiler for the rest of this video, he does actually end up scoring the equaliser. So that was kind of obvious. The other change I wanted to highlight, though, was Charlie Lakin came off for McKentry. And now, that is a huge change because the physicality that McKentry brought into midfield was really, really important. And Notts were dominating that battle. We spoke about how they were getting a lot of time on the ball. And that was the key adjustment, and McKentry was a huge part of that. But that is the key first adjustment from Walsall, and it was obvious instantly. And you had to expect Walsall to come flying out the traps. Most teams do when they're 1-0 down at half time. They'll come out a lot more aggressive. But the first huge change was the distance between them from their own goal, how much further up the pitch they moved. So Sadler, that's the first tactical adjustment he made, was, as you can see from the starting positions, they've moved up a good 5 to 10 yards from where they were in the first half. In the first half they were a lot deeper, and the space between the lines is probably the biggest significant one as well. That was a lot more expanded. They're 1-0 down. They had to take some risks, so they left just the 3 players back instead of having the 3 protecting them. The wing-backs pushed on, but the midfield 3 was the key thing for me, which allowed the front 2 to then step up and press the back 3. And that was the key thing that was instantly evident, was the high press, the intensity and the energy from which they pressed straight off the bat in the second half. They came out flying, and that was absolutely huge. But it was not just a press. A press is, it's easy for you to go and press the opposition, but it comes from the whole shape, and they had to shift the whole side forwards in order to release that press, in order to release the players to make that press effective. And that is a risk-taking element. Notts in the first half were breaking the lines with ease, and Sadler gambled that Notts wouldn't be able to do that. In a sense, a calculated gamble, of course. But if Notts had been able to pass through the lines like this, you then have a 3v3 if Crowley pushes on, and there would have been chances. As it was, that's not what happened. And what Walsall did was, what Matt Sadler did was extremely clever. So the obvious element is the press, and that was key, evident and quite obvious to anyone watching, was that they were straight on. As soon as the ball was played back to centre backs, the midfielder would step up and try and create a 2v1. Wing back would also prevent that passing angle back there. It was all about putting Notts on the back foot, always forced to go back to the keeper. They would then try and step onto the keeper, who would be forced to go long. That's kind of expected, but the little nuance to it was that they targeted one man in particular, Rod McDonald, who we spoke about. I feel he had a good first half, but as we spoke about in that first half, he was on the opposite side. He's a left-footed player. That meant that McKentry, who came on for Lakin, able to step up and press. And they targeted McDonald because they know he hasn't got the natural passing angle to come back and play a pass onto his right or through to the middle. He would have to come back on his left and play into the centre-back, who was also being kind of marked and pressed. So instead he had to go back to the goalkeeper. And it was through Rod McDonald, which they didn't force an error out of him in particular, but it was him who they targeted because of that natural angle where he comes back on inside onto his left foot, rather than being able to open his body out and play on his natural right side. And that, to me, was the absolutely crucial key difference. It seems like something really simple, but it was massively, massively effective. And the way in which they were relentless with their pressure, it meant that Notts had no way out. They stopped this pass into the midfield too. They took a risk. That pass was no longer available, either by going tight, going in front, or even behind, but that pass was no longer available because they were on them. As soon as the ball's played back, you also jump, cut out the passing lane. Notts were unable to pick up these pockets of space. Martin was forced back. He couldn't come in, and if the ball was around this side, he couldn't come in and pop up in this kind of space here because of how many bodies Walsall had. Had he gone there, you then free up another player to go and press. It meant that McGoldrick became the outball. Absolutely nothing was sticking to McGoldrick, again, because they were going tight to him, and he was unable to. He had a couple of turns, but what Walsall also did quite cleverly was to use tactical fouls. They would foul McGoldrick in non-threatening positions, doesn't draw a yellow card, kills the momentum of Notts' attack as well. Notts weren't really able to put a lot of passes together consistently, as we saw from the passing numbers. And it meant that Notts as well were getting rid of it in these areas quite a lot. The centre-back would be forced to put it out into touch or behind to get rid of the danger because of the pressure. But you can just see from the positions of the players how much more pressure there is on Notts. Like I said, had they been able to break the lines with the passing, they'd be able to get into this area and they would have had some joy. And that was the idea with the long out ball into McGoldrick. which breaks the press. But you had 3 centre-backs against 2, and they were able to press him tightly, and McGoldrick wasn't really able to make anything stick, and it wasn't working for him. There can be some criticism of Notts. Notts didn't adapt to these changes particularly well. You have to expect Walsall to come out of the traps flying for 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes you can accept to be on the back foot. Around that mark, around 10, 15 minutes in, Alex Bass went down with an injury. I can't say it wasn't an injury, but he played on and was fine. That seemed to just calm the game down a little bit for Notts. That's what Notts need to do. The game was being played at a frenetic pace, which suited Walsall. That's what they wanted. They wanted to force Notts into mistakes. But Alex Bass went down, and he was able to slow the game down just ever so slightly. But that still didn't work. The pressure kept telling. A lot of credit needs to go to Walsall for fitness levels. They played a lot of minutes, these players, but they pressed relentlessly, worked really hard. But Notts just couldn't cope with the pace of the game. And 20 minutes in, the other kind of key point to mention is the set pieces. Second half, Walsall dominated the set pieces. They had the threat from the long throw-ins, especially down this side. But they dominate the set pieces. They get the goal through Jamil Matt. And Notts did kind of feel like they kind of got back into the game a little bit after that. But no adjustment was ever really made. And it was Walsall on top. They had momentum for the whole second half. The press was relentless. They didn't drop off after they got the equaliser. They were going for the win at that point, and they had all the momentum. And that ended up happening. Nathan Lowe ended up scoring the winner. And so Notts did have a goal at the end, which I don't know if it's onside or offside. McGoldrick, very late on, scored at the back post. The angle you see from the replay it's not conclusive. But I don't think it really matters. And that's the way to say about a 90th plus whatever minute equaliser. But Walsall had done enough to win that game. And I think on the balance of play, they probably, overall just shaded it. The stats do also, back up the fact that Walsall did just about do enough. As you can see on the overall stats, not still dominating possession, but Walsall having more shots, higher XG, and that came from their second half performance and the adjustments that Matt Sadler made, targeting Rob McDonald at right centre-back, pushing the team up completely in terms of starting positions, 5 to 10 yards, intensity with which they pressed. They all combined and Walsall got back to what they do best, which was playing with intensity, with pace, and playing with purpose and going forwards and hurting Notts at the key moments. And that's what they did. They scored at the right times, and they didn't relent. And that's what Walsall do best. They put on the pressure and they move the ball forwards quickly, but that's what they do best. They keep going, and it's not the first time this season that Walsall have made kind of second half adjustments, which has won them games of football. And they made a couple of extra subs late on. Notts made a couple of changes. Joe Jones came on. Conor Grant unable to really impact and affect the game. You could argue that maybe Jack Hinchy should have come on for Notts to try and calm the game down and maybe sacrifice an outlet and try and control the game more. But then by sacrificing an outlet, you are encouraging even more pressure on. Really, it required bravery and composure from Notts to try and play through that high press, but that is easier said than done. That's so difficult, especially when it's such a well-organised press from Walsall. And to give the video another plug, if you haven't watched it yet, you can go and watch the tactical breakdown. But one thing I mentioned in there was the consistency of team selection from Walsall, and what that's allowed that to do is it allowed the Walsall players to create bonds and relationships between each other. And when you go and press a team in the second half and you've sat off them completely in the first half, you are relying on knowing those players so well. And that comes from playing alongside each other week in, week out, consistent team selection. So when they pressed, they knew that their teammate would be with them 5 to 6 yards or 10 yards, whatever the spacing is between them, because they played alongside each other so often. So those relationships and those bonds that they formed ultimately allow them to make that adjustment in game, and Matt Sadler showed his tactical nous and won his Walsall side that game. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video. Hopefully I've covered everything there. Do let me know if you enjoyed the style of video, if there's something I could do differently with it, or if you enjoyed it, the tactical whiteboard, etc. Those kind of things. Do please let me know below. If you could like the video, that would be massively appreciated. It would help out, get the video out to more people. If you could subscribe, it'd be, again, hugely appreciated. Last video I said we're nearly at 700. We've hit that now, so thank you guys so much for that. I guess let's aim for 800. We are some way off that, but let's aim for it. So if you could subscribe, that would be brilliant. I hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in the next one.